Hey guys, this is Ari Whitten, and welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. Today I have with me Kyle Davies, who is a chartered psychologist, a therapist, a coach, a speaker, and author of The Intelligent Body, Reversing Chronic Fatigue and Pain from the Inside Out. He's also the creator of Energy Flow Coaching, which is a mind-body approach to help people achieve optimal well-being and experience greater personal freedom. He spent the last 15 years helping sufferers of chronic health issues like chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, depression, and anxiety recover their health and live richer, more rewarding lives. So I'd like to welcome him to the show, and it's a great episode, and I hope you guys enjoy it. So welcome, Kyle. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks for being here. Thanks for being here. Thanks for having me, I should say, not thanks for being here.
So let's start off by just having you tell everyone a little about how you came to do what it is that you do and how you got into this particular approach to dealing with fatigue.
Okay. So I am a psychologist by original trade. I started my life working in management consulting, doing a whole range of different things. I was particularly interested in the kind of coaching side of stuff. But one of the things that was kind of interesting to me was I felt within a work context, people kind of wore a mask. They were a manager or they were a technician or whatever they were. You know, they were playing their role. And I was kind of keen to get a bit deeper. So I trained in a variety of different types of therapy, opened a clinic in around 1999 and started working with stress, anxiety, depression, those sorts of things. Then in 2002, I was introduced to a medical doctor who was based up in Scotland. I live in Wales. And he was particularly interested in chronic fatigue syndrome because his girlfriend at the time had it and there was nothing he could do for her, which was, I think that kind of drove him nuts because as a doctor, they're a bit arrogant and he was like, oh my God, I should be able to help her, but I can't. So he had done some of the same training that I had done and he'd started a little practice on the side and he was trying various ideas, taking the methods that we kind of learned, tweaking them, changing things. And before long, he was beginning to notice that he was having some, he was making a difference. So I was introduced to him. We started to develop that work, started to train practitioners. At the time, back in 2002, it was early days. There was nothing else around for people with CFS, fibro, and those sorts of things. So we thought, oh, this is great. It's not that we've got all the answers here, but we've definitely got something that works. That seems to work. It seems to work for a huge number of people that we're working with. So at the time, we thought we'd be sort of rich and famous, really. But what was interesting about it was because the work is based on emotion and stress. For the most part, people still entertain the idea of a mind-body split. Mm-hmm. So people would say to us, well, how can you possibly help a physical condition because you're talking about something that's all in the mind? So there was a lot of resistance, and I think there still is resistance, even though today there are, 15 or so years later, there is a variety of different treatment approaches now that come from the same sort of background. There's a lot of people out there that still want medicine to come up with the answer, and they still have that sort of mind-body split. Mm-hmm. If you use the word emotion, people are often thinking, oh, this is made up, it's all in my mind, it's not real, so no, you're wrong, that can't be right. So that's the background. And I guess one of the interesting things as well was, I tried for a long time to get research done, but it's amazing how hard it is to have academics, look at what you do. So I went around a variety of universities in Britain, and I spoke to a professor here, and he said to me, this is great. He said, I think you've got something here. He said, but you find there's no money for new ideas like this. And I thought, God, that's that's really interesting. It's profoundly sad, but
Yeah.
it's really it's very interesting. So my business partner then, he'd been a GP. He came out to being a GP, and after a while got jaded, really, I think, because he felt that whereas he was hoping that we'd make progress, he found himself in business, and he didn't want to be in business. He wanted to be, just helping people. So he went back to being a GP, and I've kind of kept the flag flying, obviously continued to change and evolve the process, and still working with it.
Excellent. So, one thing I wanted to comment on, I didn't want to interrupt your flow in your introduction, but, this mind-body split. And one of the interesting things that's, I think, going on there when it comes to chronic fatigue is, people who are experiencing chronic fatigue know that it's a very visceral thing that in their body, they can feel their body just doesn't have this, the energy to do what they need to do and to function. And they can feel if they try to walk up a flight of stairs or, do anything physical, there's this very real body component to it. Yet at the same time, in conventional medical circles, chronic fatigue syndrome historically has been viewed as a purely psychosomatic thing, where it's often viewed as hypochondria or just depression, and these people are prescribed, antidepressants. It's viewed as purely in the mind by a lot of MDs. It has historically been. So there's been this kind of contrast, and now, fortunately, in the last few years, there's been some studies that have emerged showing, there's layers of dysfunction going on in the brain and in the body and in the mitochondria and, hormonal stuff. And, there's lots of different layers of dysfunction in both the brain and body. And so anyway, I just wanted to mention that it's kind of interesting how the experience of chronic fatigue for someone with it meshes with, the way that a lot of MDs have historically viewed it.
Well, that's the point, I suppose, isn't it? It's been diagnosed through exclusion, and unfortunately, that's again because of the attitude of medicine to a certain degree has been, if we can't see it, it's not real. And I think that one of the reasons probably why a certain proportion of the population of sufferers have been hostile to these sorts of treatments is because they've already felt that they've been treated badly by medicine, so they want to be taken seriously. So rather than having us saying, oh, well, it actually is all in your head, which, of course, we haven't been saying, but they're assuming that we are because medicine can't measure it. But as you say, things are beginning to change now. Mm-hmm. But I mean, our sense was there was always something going on in the muscles. Now, whether they were chemically working, I know Dr. John Sarno and his work, he talked about a crystallizing of oxygen or something in muscles, but we always saw it as HPA axis. There's something going on within the emotional midbrain. It's becoming overactive at some level. Not that we've been able to measure that, but we're assuming that it probably must be, and that then affects nervous system, endocrine system, and whatnot, and that then is what leads to the experience of symptoms. So the symptoms are real because there's that chain reaction, and from my perspective, it's a chain reaction of emotional stress or stress, because I guess that's one of the interesting things about stress as well, isn't it? Is that whether you have a physical injury, whether you have an emotional trauma, whether you have a bad case of flu or an illness, you have a bad diet, if you take into drugs, the stress response in the body is exactly the same. And I think that's one of the key things, especially with mind-body, is that, again, people often view stress as being that agitated feeling that you have if you've had a hard day at work. Whereas that agitated feeling, for me, is a feeling. I think one of the crucial things about stress is that a body can be in a state of stress without us being aware of it. And the fact that all those different things can trigger the stress response, for me, is kind of interesting. I mean, last year I had 2 clients with fibromyalgia that started with me, and two who said, my fibro was caused by a car accident. Now, for me, a car accident, again, triggers the stress response. So it's the simple way that I see it, it's almost like having a stress bucket, and all of these things go inside. So if you're eating poorly, if you're sleeping badly, if you're maybe over exercising, if you're drinking excessively, if you're burying emotions, which for me is the big thing, emotion gets shoved down and down and down in that stress bucket. And then of course a car accident on top. For me, that was the final straw that tips them into illness. But I think it's useful to see that expanded perspective on stress, rather than that common idea of stress as being that nervous, agitated feeling that people get. So yeah, I guess I've always seen it as something, the symptoms as being real, not something that anyone is just think that they have. But yeah, it's just, I guess it's taken a long time for medicine to find out what's going on.
Yeah, and I appreciate the paradigm that you just kind of presented here is a very, big, kind of holistic, all-encompassing paradigm. And, I think it helps explain, a lot of just the chronic disease that's occurring in general in the world right now. There's a huge epidemic of increases of all kinds of different chronic diseases, from psychological things, anxiety, depression, to, chronic fatigue syndromes and fibromyalgia and autoimmune conditions, Hashimoto's and Crohn's. And, I'm just wondering if you could talk a little about the link kind of between all of these different
it's a big question. That it's interesting, because I remember years ago reading the book When the Body Says No by Dr. Gabor Mate, and at the time we'd been subject to people being reasonably hostile towards us because we were saying that emotion can lead to illness. And we were obviously talking about CFS and fibro, where the symptoms are reversible. And when I read When the Body Says No, he was talking about cancer, heart disease, arthritis. I'm thinking, well, good on you, because you're out there and you're basically saying the same thing as we're saying, but you're saying about the big things. So my sense of it is probably the case that chronic illness has a number of primary causes. That would be my guess, and that it's like a combination lock, and when all of the factors are lined up with your genes, with your diet, your exercise, all those things that are in that stress bucket, the environment, your emotion, when all of these things are kind of lined up, the lock opens, or the lock shuts, really, and you get ill. So why does one person have chronic anxiety and one person have chronic pain? Could it be their genes? I don't have a definitive answer to that. My sense is that it probably is. Because my focus has been on, as a one-to-one practitioner with people I've seen, and groups as well, but is working with people and trying to distill the ideas down into something that people can understand and work with. I've adopted a similar approach. There are unique elements for if I'm working with depression or anxiety or fibro, but it's the underlying essence of it is still the same, which is that, well, your stress bucket is full, and the main thing that I'm going to look at is your emotion and the extent to which that's blocked, and we've got to get that flowing in. We've got to get you back in touch with you. But I would look, I guess one of the things for me as well over the years is that because the work I've been doing is reasonably new, and these ideas are reasonably new, I would say the vast majority of people that have CFS and fibro and those sorts of chronic fatigue and pain issues, they will have already looked at diet. For the most part, most people can't exercise anyway, but a lot of them would have spent a long time looking at diet and would be taking various things. So I never really tinkered with that because it's not my field anyway. But it's lots of people would have looked at what seems to work for them and what doesn't work for them. And it was often that emotional, which was the big piece, it seemed to me, was the piece that they needed to sort. But my sense as well, in terms of that combination, that it's probably different for different people. So my guess is that there'll be some people where the emotion being blocked up is a huge piece. Maybe for others, their diet may be the biggest piece. And that probably varies. And I wonder whether, if you get drawn to a particular type of therapy, that may be because you kind of sense, well, this is probably what's right for me.
Yeah, maybe interesting. Since you work one-to-one with people and you're working primarily with, psycho-emotional, psycho-spiritual types of things, I'm curious what kinds of insights you have into personality differences. Maybe some unique personality traits that you see very commonly in people with chronic fatigue. And I've seen some research on this, in the area of achiever types and self-critical perfectionism and things of that nature. But I'm curious, just as a clinician working in that area, what kinds of things you've seen.
It's probably the same sorts of things, really. So it's a perfectionism. It's a tendency to put other people before themselves. A lot of that tends to stem from childhood, where there's been issues at home, and there's been problems with a parent, so that the child has looked after the parent and put the parent's needs before their own. And as they've grown up, that's become the pattern. So it's often, I guess the way I see it and the patterns I've seen are really about a need to define oneself. So I find that there can be an issue where my clients often don't know where they end and other people begin. Now that sounds a bit weird, but in terms of opinions or viewpoints, sometimes they will easily absorb those of others. And again, that mixes in with, well, we'll do what you feel you want to do rather than what I feel is right with me. So there is definitely a disconnect from what I would call their true self. And it comes from a very externalized view of, I need to match myself to the world. So defining themselves has been something they're not quite sure at. What can come with that as well is unfair treatment. So lots of them will find there's a history of being badly treated by others. So it's getting that sort of boundary in place as well. But that's, I guess, it's kind of broad brush. I'm always kind of conscious with saying those things, that everyone's case is unique. Mm-hmm. It's almost like symptoms. There's overlap in symptoms of fatigue and pain, but everyone has their own unique little things that are happening. So everyone's experience of life is different, and every case is different. But yeah, I guess there are those broad brush kind of areas, but the thing of defining oneself and putting other people before me are that's quite a big pattern.
Is that something that you make a point of really addressing in your work with people?
I guess it is. As I say, what I try to do with everybody I work with is start with a blank slate to a certain extent. So I'm conscious of the things that are probably going to arise, but I'm aware that they might not. So I don't try to just imprint that on them. But yeah, the patterns often emerge, but as I say, in their own unique sort of ways.
So, there's been a lot of discussion in recent years, in the last, couple decades, around stress. And we also know that depression and anxiety are now becoming an epidemic all over the Western world. And I'm just wondering, as a psychologist, if you have any unique insights into why stress and depression and anxiety are now such a big deal and are so common.
I think in a simple way, and I guess my preference in the work that I do is to keep things as simple as we can, is that we've deviated from ourselves, our true selves. So we're very externalized in our focus. We're trying to be productive all the time. We're trying to succeed. We're trying to do well. And there seems to be this endless pressure, not only to succeed at work, but you have to be happy. You've got to be well traveled. You've got to post your pictures online, all this kind of stuff. So you've got to be seen to be having this amazing life. And I think that, what's happening is with that external focus, I think that we're deviating further and further from who we really are. I think so. That's one aspect. I think that probably as a culture, our lifestyles are quite different from the lifestyles we've led for hundreds of thousands of years, where we've lived outdoors in small tribes where we connect. Whereas now we live in a box, we drive to work in a box, we often sit in a box, we stare at a box, and so that kind of fulfillment is devoid in many people's lives, I think. And so I guess culture in that regard has moved on, has evolved quicker than we have. So I think that, there are simple things out there of it's good to get out in nature, and people notice the difference it makes. And even though it's, oh my God, it can't be that simple, but it can have a big effect. So my sense of it is that we become very externalized. There's a focus on trying to match ourselves to some version we think the world wants of us. And we're not taught about how important it is to connect with ourselves, our feelings, and who we are. And I think, as I say, I think that coupled with this, I think as a result, those things that combined with this idea that it's very easy to be in a lifestyle where you get stuck in a trance-like state of, I have to go to work, I've got debt, and because we're always on and we're having to look at the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, people kind of live in their heads. You're washing dishes while you're thinking about the next 6 things that you have to do. And I think with that, people are continually doing the same things over and over again. So they're reinventing the same version of themselves. So if they don't feel good, their feelings, their thoughts, their perceptions, they're just repeating the same patterns over and over. So I think the combination of that is probably what is giving rise to there's a third point which I'll just I'll check in. I think the third point, and this is really a personal perspective, which is I wonder whether we're defining problems too quickly. So I think that there is a tendency to medicate in our culture. So antidepressants in Wales, and I think that's the same as the UK as a whole, the prescriptions for them have doubled in the last 6 years.
Yeah, the same trend exists in the United States as well.
It's unbelievable. But I think the thing is if people are not feeling great, they go to their doctor, because doctors, certainly here, they've got about 5 minutes with you. They want to get you out the door. They'll give you something. And I think these days people go to their doctor and they ask. So my sense of it is that there's a really interesting thing that I think that for me, and this is, I guess, part of my work, is I feel that as a human being, there's a natural flow, there's cycles to life, and there's a flow to how we are. So there are times where we feel connected, we feel good, we feel, great, and there's times where we feel off kilter, we don't feel so good, we feel a bit low. And there's a natural swing with that. For me, our tendency is to feel better, but we do have those swings. My sense of it is that we too quickly try to fix ourselves when we dip. And I think what happens is when we attempt to fix ourselves, often we keep ourselves locked down in that space of not feeling good. And I think that then people go and they're seeking something outside of themselves, where in many instances, which I guess we sort of see this with kids. You see this with kids where, especially when they're small, they can be happy one minute, they're crying the next, they're best friends with somebody, then they hate them, then they're best friends again. But there is this flow because they don't hold grudges, because their frontal lobes are not developed, so they don't overthink it. Whereas when we get a bit older, we feel something, it triggers our thinking, and then we start to analyze stuff and say, oh shit, I shouldn't feel like this, I shouldn't, and then we get stuck in this not feeling good, and oh my God, I should fix myself. And it's when I work with people, one of the first things I do is have people stop all of their attempts at fixing themselves, because I think there is this I know that sounds a bit weird, but I sort of say, well, what I'd like you to do is just focus on the things that we're going to do, because we want to spend the minimum amount of time on therapy, the maximum amount of time on living life, on being you. And for some people, it's they turn white, because aside from if they're able to work, there's work, but aside from the kind of chores of life, the rest of their life is very often spent with trying to fix themselves. And this means researching, reading, being on forums, all this sort of stuff. And it all comes from a foundation of, there's something wrong with me, I need to fix myself. So I think generally, as a Western culture, I wonder whether we are sort of fixated with having to feel good all of the time, and we don't allow ourselves to feel the flow that is life. Because I think if we didn't frantically try to fix ourselves so quickly, I wonder whether we'd naturally, get back to feeling normal, and life would flow, rather than, oh my God, I've got to fix myself with something. Whatever that may be. It could be food, it could be drink, it could be, something I'm doing in my head. But I hope I'm sort of waffling a bit there. But those are, broadly speaking, my kind of 3 points. But the last one is a bit more of a, I guess, a personal point. But as I say, I've seen that from people that are very ill, that I need to fix myself. But I think as a culture, we are too eager to think that we should be happy and pumped and doing.
Yeah, there's a couple things that you bring to mind that I want to mention here. One is just to point out that there's a bit of a catch-22 in there, which is that if somebody does genuinely feel that there's something wrong with them, they want to do something to fix it, and yet it can actually be problematic, as you're saying, to devote so much time and focus and attention and energy towards, there's something wrong with me, I need to fix this.
Yeah.
Right. So it's hard to, I guess, find the balance point in there, where
the balance point, I say, comes through feeling, because much of my work is largely about that, and it's about trusting that feeling. So I mean, I've had the same things myself. Last year I had knee surgery. I had an ACL, a new ACL, and when I damaged my knee, for a few days, I was almost obsessive with looking online at what's wrong, what do I need to do, rehab, all this kind of stuff. And I could feel myself becoming more and more tense. And it sort of hit me that I need to practice what I preach. So once I'd worked out my plan of action, right, well, I'm going to see this doctor, this is going to happen, I'm going to have this scan, whatever. Once that was in place, and I had my rehab program in place, it was like, stop researching. Because that was the line for me, and it's about trusting that feeling. Now, I've had the same thing with just improving myself, because all my life I wanted to be as smart as I can, as fit as I can, all these sorts of things. But again, it's one of those things where I think it's important to gauge through feeling whether, okay, am I moving in a direction of improvement here, or am I just putting pressure on myself and presupposing that I'm broken? And I think trusting that feeling that, or if I feel tense inside, there's probably something going on here, and it may well be that if I'm coming from a space of fear, or I'm putting pressure on myself to have to sort something out, then the feeling is feedback that I need to adjust what it is that I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I wanted to comment on that you mentioned was, this idea of, the kind of the trends as far as prescription of antidepressants, and just that if prescriptions of antidepressants are doubling in the span of 6 years or 10 years or whatever, or they're tripling in 20 years or whatever the trends are, that we need to observe that trend and ask, why are rates of depression skyrocketing if they are?
Yeah.
And the answer shouldn't just be, well, it's because there's neurochemical imbalances in the brain that need antidepressants to fix them.
Yeah.
If indeed
that's not the case anyway.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if indeed that is, I'm just saying, if you're operating in that paradigm of even antidepressant sort of drug fix paradigm, they should at the very least be asking the question, why are these neurotransmitter imbalances all of a sudden skyrocketing in prevalence? And there should be some kind of questioning as to why that's happening, or if you're not operating in a neurotransmitter centric paradigm, still the question is, why are rates of depression skyrocketing in the modern world? And then there should at least be some kind of attempt to address those underlying factors, which you had mentioned some of those factors earlier.
Well, yeah, I guess so, but I guess it depends who you ask, doesn't it? So obviously, I'm interested in I'm putting forward a theory as to cause. Obviously, what we know with medicine is, despite all the fantastic things that it does, is that it doesn't address cause, and it's not looking to. The drug companies are probably not looking to do that either. They're looking to sell drugs and keep symptoms at bay. So it's good for business, though, wouldn't it, really? All those drugs being sold.
Yeah.
But that's, I suppose it depends who's asking that question. Yeah, you'd think, well, that is the question to ask. What the hell is going on here, and what can we do? But in whose interest is it to get an answer to that question? Obviously, we would argue it's in the interest of, Joe Public, but medicine is a big beast, and certainly in this country it's kind of overstretched. So trying to get it to it's like a big tanker in the sea. Trying to get it to change direction is not easy.
So one other thing I want to go back to is this idea that you mentioned of people feeling like something's wrong with me and I need to do something to fix me. Yes. Now, as a psychologist and as a practitioner working one-on-one with people, how do you find the balance there between, the fact that part of the reason that person is there to see you is, the kind of the underlying thing in that dynamic is actually it's an attempt to get help to fix something that's wrong with them. So yes. How do you, I guess, find the balance in that? On the one hand, you're telling them kind of not to be in that place of always trying to fix yourself, yet they're there to see you in kind of an effort to fix themselves.
Yeah, it's, as I was kind of saying earlier, it's really what we want is the minimum amount of time spent on fixing oneself. Essentially, that's the kind of idea. It's, okay, well, how do we know something is a problem? And so let me give you an example. I've got a client at the moment, and she's a coaching client, so I do life coaching as well. And she's going through divorce, and she's having she's experiencing a lot of anger, a lot of fear, a lot of sadness. And in the first session, it became apparent that she was viewing the experience or presence of those feelings as a problem. So she was trying to normalize them by talking to her friends. Is this normal? Am I allowed to feel this? Should I feel this? Should I feel something else? And because she was kind of in a space of believing that I probably shouldn't be feeling these things, she was then sort of trying to fix herself, or she was trying to sort it out, mainly in her head. And that's generally what happens, is because the presence of uncomfortable feelings tends to trigger our thinking or exacerbate our thinking. A lot of the time our thinking is based around trying to find meaning in what we're feeling or trying to solve what we're feeling. So there was a huge amount of her discomfort was arising from believing that what she was feeling was a problem. So I spent a session with her, just inviting her to believe that everything she feels is perfectly okay. Her feelings are never a problem and don't need to be solved. So the idea that, like, it's all right, I don't have to normalize this. I don't have to talk to my friends about it. I can just allow my feelings to be. If they're guiding me to take some action, great, but otherwise I can let them be. That was a huge relief for her. So it's that idea of, well, how do we know what a problem is? It's just defining that. And if I'm working with somebody with pain or fatigue symptoms, obviously we know, well, that is a problem. But again, it's that idea, well, what we want to do is identify exactly what is going on. From my perspective, a symptom is a messenger, and essentially that our stress bucket is full, looking at it in that very simple way. But what we want to do is identify, okay, so when are those symptoms presenting themselves, because your body's trying to tell you something when they are, and we want to work out what your body's trying to tell you so we can do something. And if we're not doing that, then you want to be, as best you can, enjoying life as much as that is possible, given what you're experiencing. So it's really trying to define what the problem is. Is this a problem? Okay, this is a problem. This maybe isn't a problem. Okay, and what are our steps? What do we need to do to kind of move to where we want to be? Because this is where I'd like to be. This is my kind of, outcome. How do I get there? What's the most expedient way of me achieving that? And as I say, like me with my knee, it's very easy to be consumed. And when you become consumed with, oh my God, I've got to fix this, I've got to fix this, that internal pressure can build. And of course, my knee issue, I guess, is a bit different, because that was an injury which was caused by something I did at the gym, and the emotions of tension and pressure that I was feeling probably weren't exacerbating that injury. Now, conversely, if you're experiencing fatigue and pain symptoms or anxiety symptoms, and the emotion in your stress bucket is a big component of why those symptoms are present, the additional pressure and tension that is present is exacerbating those symptoms.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. And I kind of went back to this point. I find it a very interesting topic. Personally, I actually went through a PhD program in clinical psychology. And,
oh my God, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so we have some. So I want to talk to you more about that. But you're bringing up a lot of things that are very interesting to me. I'm actually having to censor all these thoughts that are in my head and kind of not digress into too many different topics here. But one thing I did want to mention is, while I was in school, I definitely noticed a very common thing among some of the other PhD students, which was that there can be this tendency to endlessly psychoanalyze. And it can become almost an addiction to talk about your inner dynamics, psychological, emotional dynamics, analyze other people's. And it was, what we talked about all of the time. And I actually got sick of it at a certain point. And I said kind of what you just said a few minutes ago, which is that at a certain point, I want to be done psychoanalyzing, and I just want to live my life. I don't want to be endlessly trying to analyze myself and others that I'm interacting with, and trying to figure things out so that we can get to a point where, with the kind of idea in mind, the presupposition that once we do enough analyzing and healing, then you can get to a place where you can live your life well. And I saw at a certain point that the psychoanalyzing was almost an addiction. It was an obsession, and it would have never ended unless you make the decision to say, I want to be, for the most part, I figured out as much as I can figure out right now. Maybe I can come back to more psychoanalyzing at a later time, but I figured out what I can figure out now. Now I want to go just actually live and enjoy my life, rather than more psychoanalysis in order to get to a place where I can live my life. And I just want to make the point that I've seen a lot of people wrapped up in a place psychologically where they're always trying to heal themselves, always trying to fix themselves. And I've literally seen people do this for decades of their life and never get to a place where they say, okay, now I'm good enough as a human being that I can actually just live my life instead of trying to spend all my time trying to fix myself.
Yeah. It's huge. Yeah. And the addiction part of it, I think, it applies to lots of things. We get stuck in little patterns where we obsess with all sorts of things in life. But yeah, I think it's huge, that. And and my sense of it is, and I'm sure there are other views on this, is that by developing self-awareness and feeling, there is, because I have this, esoteric idea of a true self that is going to give us feedback, that, what I need to do is trust, because my guess, obviously that was happening with you because there was something within you that registered, okay, enough is enough here. And I think one of the problems we have is we become so kind of head or thinking or mind orientated that we lose touch with that feeling feedback. I don't think we place the importance on it that we need to. Mm-hmm. And because I think that I think feelings will let you know. But as I say, I think we've become a society, a culture where we just override feelings. Yeah. And we're kind of from kids in school, it's all about thinking, it's all about developing your cognitive stuff, isn't it? It's not, you're not really taught about emotions, intuitive feelings, and the importance of trusting those things and being guided and balancing those things. It's all about maths and physics and English and history and making sure you're remembering things. And
yeah,
so it's balance, I think, is important there.
For sure. Yeah. One more question related to psychology. I'm curious what schools of thought or schools of psychotherapy you've been most influenced by. And, from the sound of it, it sounds like you've kind of developed your own mixing and melding of kind of different methods and to form your own method. But I'm curious if you favor certain schools of thought or if certain schools of thought have influenced you more than others.
It's a good question, because it's probably been a long time since I've researched in all this stuff. So when I started in therapy, I did some counseling training, which was humanistic counseling. I did a lot of NLP. I did Ericksonian hypnosis work. I did a lot of tapping therapies. I did some CBT, and I get, I'm 47 now, so I've continued to read, so I couldn't say really that I guess everything has an influence.
Yeah.
My approach was cognitively orientated when I started out, and I think one of the interesting things was working with fatigue and pain. It seemed to me that changing people's thoughts didn't really work, and this is what we were finding. And this was why we kind of had a different view on what emotion was, because the prevailing view was that our emotion is the end result of a thinking process. So if you want to change your emotion, you have to change your thinking. And that didn't seem kind of right to me. Because what we were finding was that, well, if we can get people to pay attention to their emotion and act in alignment with it, actually that seems to alleviate their symptoms. Whereas if you get them to change their thinking, that doesn't seem to do that. And then I came across the work of Heart Math out there in California with you, and they're obviously interested in the heart, and their research was showing that our emotional processing occurs at higher speeds than our cognitive processing, and that seemed to fall in line with what we were finding, really, that it seemed that even though there is this very complex mix of thinking, emotion, environment, behavior, it seems to me that our emotion was affecting our thinking more than our thinking was affecting our emotion. And I was also interested as well in the idea of thinking and feeling being slightly different things. So this comes from the work of Antonio Damasio. And I thought that's kind of really interesting, because we use the words interchangeably normally, but his idea was that our emotion is a non-conscious process. And he was saying that, well, the brain systems involved in feeling are slightly different to those involved in emotion. And it kind of made sense in terms of the sort of things I was saying with regard to symptoms, because it seemed to me that when emotion builds up, it's possible for us to block our feelings and not become aware of feelings. And I think this is essentially what happens to people, is that feelings get blocked to the extent that people don't feel those feelings. And it's almost as if, because the body uses feelings as a way to get our attention, if the feelings are not getting through, that it switches to using something else, and it begins to use symptoms. And what I found is that people's experience of symptoms always gets worse. So if I'm working with somebody with chronic fatigue or fibro, they would have always started much earlier in life with something mild. It could be anxiety, it could be some depression, it could be stomach problems, it could be insomnia, it could be some headaches. And it always starts with some mild symptoms that either go, because there seems to be some sort of cycle with the way symptoms come and go, and they come back more intensely, or they would have done some work to alleviate those symptoms, and then at some point later they come back, and every time they come back more intensely. And it was kind of interesting because I thought, well, what it could be then that what's happening is possible for us to block feelings so that we don't have them, but we can't block emotion, because emotion is a non-conscious process, and that is affecting the midbrain and therefore the systems. So my sense of it then was, I guess, kind of that, and my colleagues, was that, well, probably what's happening is, say, emotion is building up, not being felt, and the body is using symptoms more and more intensely to get our attention. I've probably gone right off your original question, which I can't remember at all.
It's great. And I'm actually really glad that you brought up Damasio, because it's actually a major pet peeve of mine when people talk about thoughts and feelings and emotions without reading his work, because most people don't really understand the meaning of those words. He's by far, I think, the best. That's the best explanation from a very, grounded scientific and neurological perspective of what these different things are, and where they exist in the brain, and what these words mean, because a lot of people use these words kind of to mean different things. So I think the explanation was great. So one of the other things I wanted to ask you about is, in your bio you mentioned that you meld the scientific with the metaphysical, and we've talked a lot about psycho-emotional stuff, but I'm wondering what you mean by metaphysical, and how you think kind of the metaphysical aspect of thing figures into all of this.
So I'm a bit spiritually weird and a bit woo-woo, but I'm very conscious that there are lots of people out there suffering who are not. So I guess in terms of the way I work, I tend to, if people are interested in spiritually things, and I tend to direct the way work down that path. But if people are not, then we don't have to. So what does it mean? Okay, so I've talked about a true self. There is an idea, well, what does that mean? Is that your soul? Well, it could be. I think I have a sense that history repeats itself in terms of the things that people experience, and what I've seen with clients. So I kind of look at it from a perspective of, it's almost as if we have life lessons that we come in and we draw towards us circumstances and people that enable us to learn those lessons because we have experiences. So from a spiritual perspective, in a reasonably bland sort of way, I suppose I make it all about the person. So your life is about you, it's your journey. And it's not that your boss makes you angry, it's your emotion arises inside of you. But it's ultimately, it's about you. So we don't want to blame your boss. What we want to do is understand what your feelings are trying to teach you about the way you go about life. So there's that, and there's the kind of idea that, well, a sense that to a large extent we probably are creating our experience. We're definitely playing a huge role in our feeling experience, because my belief is that our emotion is feedback about our interaction with our environment and the meaning that we place on that environment. So I don't believe that our emotion is caused directly by what goes on out there. I think it comes from in here as a result of kind of where we are on any given day, because I think, again, we have this, I think we exist almost on a spectrum from where we're connected and we feel good and good things happen and we have a good perception of ourselves and life. And when we're disconnected, we sort of feel off kilter. We have a negative perception of ourselves. We view life in a hostile way. So my sense of it is that, we're fluctuating on that all the time. And I guess I was, that was what I was kind of talking about earlier, was saying there seems to be this natural ebb and flow to how we feel. And my sense is that, we gravitate towards generally feeling connected and in a higher consciousness space, but we do move around. And I think a lot of the time our perception of life and our feelings often arise from where we are on that spectrum, more than it's about life itself. Because when we're not in a good, and we all have that, then we all have that, those times when we wake up in the morning and we don't feel, we feel off color, we don't feel connected, maybe our head's a bit foggy, and then maybe that we know immediately, well, I consumed this, I ate this, or I did this, or this is building up, this is frustrating. Or maybe we don't know. Maybe yesterday was exactly the same as today and the day before. But we just feel a bit off kilter. And my sense of it then is, right, well, if you know that that's going to affect my perceptions of myself and life, it's not necessarily that life is, if I go into the office that day and things happen, I may feel more emotion. But what I want to be aware of is, well, that emotion is, it's about me. It's not necessarily about my boss. So I think that, as I say, the one bit in terms of creation is, I think we're playing a large role in the creation of our feeling experience. I do think as well, I kind of like these ideas that we're probably radiating something out. And I don't know what evidence we have for this. I know HeartMath have measured, the electric and magnetic fields of the brain and the heart. But I do wonder, it seems interesting to me, the idea that we radiate some form of quantum energy or subtle energy or whatever out into life. And somehow I wonder, my sense of it is that probably influences the things that show up in our life. Mm-hmm. I think life, our expectations often happen, don't they? And I guess there's a couple of perspectives to that, isn't it? There is that, and I can't remember who did the research, but I do mention this in my book, that there was research done, and I can't think, 20 years ago, in a school in the US, and the basic idea of the research was that it was looking to see the influence of a teacher's behavior on pupils. So the teachers and pupils were not told about this experiment, but what they were told was that the students had done a particular test, and this test flagged up those pupils that were going to flourish, even if they'd shown no potential at all. This test was designed to show that up. And in this one particular class, I think it was something like 6 kids where the teacher was told, well, these 6 kids, even though they've shown no potential at all, they are going to flourish this year. And of course, there wasn't any test, but the teacher wasn't told that. But what they found was, over the course of the year, those 6 kids did flourish. And kind of idea being that the unconscious beliefs, expectations, or whatever that the teacher held resulted in them behaving in a different way towards those students. Those students then changed the way they behave. So, to a certain extent, there's scientific evidence that we are influencing life at an unconscious level. Now, whether we radiate energy as well, and that impacts, I mean, my sense of it is that it probably does, because the old cliche of life is a self-fulfilling prophecy tends to be the case, isn't it? So I don't know whether I'm answering your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's fascinating. Wonderful. So let me ask you this. If you could have people take away 3 kind of take-home messages from this interview, 3 thoughts, 3 ideas, 3 kind of strategies, or what would those 3 key messages be?
Okay, I think the first one would probably be that be open to the idea that a buildup of emotional stress can cause physical illness. I just think it is important that we allow ourselves believe that. The second thing about emotion is that, again, I think that a lot of the time people either think emotion is something that's all in the head, or is something that needs to be talked about, or is something that is built up in the past. I think it's more useful to look at emotion as a complex physiological process that presents itself in, if we're lucky, if we're not blocking it, in feeling states, in much the same way as hunger or tiredness, and arguably is just trying to give us a nudge. So in that regard, in the same regard as if I feel hungry, I don't have to justify my hunger. I don't have to talk about my hunger. I don't have to normalize it. What I need to do is recognize it's a feedback mechanism. I would say allow yourself to see emotion in the same sort of way. That I don't have to justify it, defend it, explain it, figure it out. I don't have to solve it. It's just trying to guide me. And I know it's a little bit more complex in terms of what we do, but the third bit would be the idea that everything you feel is okay. It's a much nicer world to live in when you allow your emotion to be. We generally have, because as human beings, we seem to have this kind of inbuilt mechanism to move away from discomfort towards comfort. One of the things that often happens is that as soon as there's a negative feeling, we quickly want to solve it, and we tense up and we resist it. But getting into something of a practice of allowing means that when you allow what you feel, you allow yourself. So I think that even though I don't try to define myself or our true self, I think that one of the closest ways of getting there is how I feel today. So allowing how I feel today without viewing it as a problem, without viewing it as something I have to solve, just viewing it as some gentle nudges, some gentle feedback that might be inviting me to do something, makes life much, much easier.
Yeah.
So I know I've rolled those into one, haven't I?
No, that's beautiful. Really beautiful message. So where can people find out more about what you do and get in contact with you, learn more about your work? And where would you like to direct people if they're interested in getting your book or working with you?
So my method is called Energy Flow Coaching. I'm just launching a new website which is energyflowcoaching.com. My book which has been out only a couple of months, is called The Intelligent Body, which is available all good retailers, so Barnes & Noble, Amazon, more places like that.
Beautiful. Well, it was absolutely a pleasure talking to you, Kyle, and I really appreciate you being on and sharing your wisdom.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been great.
Yeah, take care.
Thank you.